bump in the ocean, first contact and settlement on the northern Australian coast. I have got details here as to what's in it, but I think it's much better if Jock himself tells us. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Jock Schmiechen.
Contact, that word for you folks, does it? Well, it can have light, so I'll go. Thanks very much, Guy, for that extravagant introduction. I also put apologies in from Andrew Harper. It really is a bit out of his control, but I'm arranging to try and get him back before the end of the year. So maybe our last lecture of the year, Andrew can elaborate on 50 years of cameleering and trekking, mainly with tourists, because camels have been in our desert for a long time, ever since poor old John Horrocks brought the camel over here and had an incident with cleaning his gun up near Horrocks Pass, and the camel kicked him and shot Horrocks. He died a few days later, and the camel very soon after the incident, I believe. So camels have been around for a while, but Andrew would be good. So I'm going to take you on a completely different journey. This is a big one. So this is really taking you into the whole northern coast of Australia. And it is a bump in the ocean because, little old Australia, the great Southland, even the early cartographers, were thinking that there had to be something south of the equator and of the known northern world. Can I have the lights, please, Melissa? Thanks. But Australia is a very old inhabited continent. We actually have one of the oldest continuing history continuums of any civilization in the world. And that goes with our First Nations Aboriginal people. And that goes back to possibly 100,000 years, because what was happening was 100,000 years till about, well, it's a bit disputed, 7,000 years was a period of glacial maxima. It's where the ice ages were their greatest extent in the north and south poles. The ocean level was at lowest. And for a period of from virtually 100,000 to 7,000, you had a very short sea passage from the Indonesian archipelago. And that was due to the fact that we had a continental shelf called the Sahul Shelf, reaching out from the Kimberley coast. You can see that green, joining New Guinea, where the Gulf of Carpentaria is up there, was Lake Carpentaria. There's also now believed to have been a lake, a little patch there just off the Kimberley coast, Lake Bonaparte in the Bonaparte Gulf. So this meant that it was a pretty close proximity where humans had well and truly taken up occupation in the Indonesian archipelago and Timor. If we follow the theory of coming out of Africa, which is current, into Asia, Southeast Asia, people were well and truly living 100,000 years ago in that Indonesian archipelago. Now, those people looking south wouldn't have seen any land, but they would see smoke, because fires on that continental plain from lightning strikes, wildfires, would have indicated to them there's something there. Human curiosity being what it is, I think that's a huge driver to go over the horizon. So those people sort of decided possibly that they were going to have a look-see and see what was there. Sometimes it's pressure from other forces, whether it be climatic or other people, that force that sort of movement, but curiosity is a huge driver. And if you think of the Vikings, the Polynesians, of their great epic voyages, a lot of it was curiosity with a little bit of gain and a lot of pain to other people. So you had this potential where people would have made that continental shelf. Now, first couple of thousand years, life on that continental shelf would have been ideal. Would have been open grassland plain with high points. Ashmore Reef would have been a little mountain there. So people probably had a very happy existence all along that bit. But we know from the archaeology that within 10,000 years, they spread right throughout the Australian continent. And that wasn't one homogenous group of people, and wasn't all at one time. We had at the time of settlement 250 distinct language groups, nearly 700 dialects. So it was like a mosaic of small nation states all across the Australian continent. We have got a bit more accurate information from our archaeological endeavours, which have been increasing year by year. So we know for a fact that in Kakadu at Mudjabibi, which is a dig site where a rock shelter and that was being excavated, we have now several times gone into that, The consensus is the carbon dating is giving us a 65,000 year date of human endeavour in that location. Stone tools, bits of oak on the walls. So those people may have already been there for 1,000, 10,000 more years, because the oldest evidence is undoubtedly under the sea. And quite a bit of archaeology is taking place, especially around the Gulf of Carpentaria. They've already found stone arrangements, middens under the ocean floor in those locations. Kimberley, which I've done a lot of work in over many, many years, we sort of had an idea of 50,000 years plus, taken on a dig site on the Drysdale River, where a big Aeolian ancient dune has been scoured out by the river, and that whole face has been dated by geologists from about 2,000 to 60,000 years. It's spewing out artefacts. My good friend Dr. Darryl Lewis here with a very interesting stone axe head, a tanged axe. So see that little bit on the end of the axe head. Very earliest axe form, also found in New Guinea. So definitely indications that there was a strong presence here. We also have some pretty good indicators now coming out of rock art. So the link between Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Sumatra, Timor, it's not been that clear, mainly because not a lot of work's been done. But more recently, a couple of interesting new finds. Sulawesi in a limestone cave. They've now dated art in that cave to 43,000 years before present. So that's a long time back. The oldest date we have in Australia in the Kimberley, where I've been working up in the Drysdale River National Park, is based on carbon dating on mud wasp nests over paintings. That irregular infill animal that you have there, that kangaroo, is dated at 17,000 years before present. That's the youngest date, because when that wasp put the nest over, that kangaroo could have already been there for 5,000 years. That style of art, that what we call irregular infill, very similar to the warty pig, which has been depicted in the Sulawesi art. So similar art style, different animal. Warty pig, of course, more prevalent than the kangaroo. So we've got some pretty good indicators about the connection. We also have art in the Kimberley, and mainly the Kimberley, more than Arnhem Land, of early, fairly ocean-going type canoes or craft, such as this one up here with people in it, high bows. But for Aboriginal people, pretty simple. They've always been here. They're dreaming stories, which are really the ancestral creation stories about how the land was created. They also talk of voyages and coming, like here in Arnhem Land, in Nhulunbuy on the Arnhem Land coast. That set of rocks is actually a canoe by the Wagalag sisters, or the Junkaroo sisters, who came from the east, landed there, then went ashore with their digging sticks, created all sorts of things in the environment. So lots of interesting stories, some from the original inhabitants. Now, theories about other contacts on that coast. So we've had different waves of Indigenous Aboriginal people coming in while that glacial maxima held, and that held pretty much till about 7,000 or so years. We also know that the dingo arrived in Australia around about 7,000 years, which would have meant it would have migrated from those islands off the north, but it didn't get to Tasmania because the land bridge was cut by that time. And the thylacine, which was then the apex predator on the Australian mainland, suddenly disappeared as the dingo took over, but survived in Tasmania where there was no dingo until we shot it out. Sad story. The story of a great Chinese fleet from Admiral Cheng Ho in the 1400s that sailed huge junks in all different parts. Some belief that it may have touched the coast of Australia. Along with Darryl Lewis and my now departed good friend in Arnhem Land, Max Davidson, we discovered this piece of art up there. We were highly excited by this because it was unusual. It had oars, had very lantern type junk-like sail, big thing. When I showed it to George Chalupka, he sort of identified and thought, that looks like it could be Chinese. Well, could it be? Don't know. Some research has been done on since. It's discounted the Chinese theory. The actual real effect of what that particular depiction is, it's a Moluccan fighting canoe. So it comes from Macassan of the Indonesian islands. back in the time, as I'll go into, when there was a big trade going on between those islands and big prows, trading prows were coming here. That ship is of that ilk and that period. So it's going back more likely to the 1700s, 1800s. So it's not a Chinese one, but Cheng Ho sort of is in the picture. One of the first people to sort of skirt around the northern coast of Australia was actually a Spaniard, Luis Vaz de Torres. And he was part of an expedition by de Quiros from the Spanish Empire, coming out of South America, crossing the Southern Ocean, try and find this mystical Southland. De Quiros and Torres sort of fell out part of the way. De Quiros sailed off the Sant Esperanto somewhere north, and Torres kept going south, which was what the target was. And he actually navigated his way through what then got his name, that there was a gap between Cape York and New Guinea, and it later bore the name of him, Torres Strait. Portuguese were also early touches on the coastline, and we know that certainly in the Kimberley, Portuguese have been very active in colonising Timor in the early 16th century, and potentially some of their visitors may have come to this coast. We know one did for certain. A navigator from Portugal, de Mendonça, in 1620, who sailed down the whole east coast of Australia. He actually even went round the corner. I think he got nearly as far as to South Australia. Now, nothing is known of his voyage. His journals, everything else, were locked up in the library in Lisbon. All of these early explorers, Torres included, the Spaniards and the Portuguese, their information was property of the king. It was to enhance the empire, so they were very tightly controlled and locked up. Lisbon Library burnt down, and with it went all of whatever Mendonça had reported. But some French had made a copy of his map on a goat skin, and that map showed very clearly going down the east coast. And on this picture here, you have on one side Mendonça's map, on the other side Captain James Cook's map. And they're pretty much an identical mirror. Mendonça's put all his Spanish names on different things, and Cook, of course, put his names on. So that classic black Spanish caravel, or Portuguese caravel, very few of those left in existence, even plans. There's actually a gentleman in Tasmania built this one and sailed around the coast. I was yachting up on the Queensland coast when this black thing appeared around the corner, and that would have instilled all sorts of fear in local inhabitants when they saw these things arrive. Would have been not a good news day. Now, what else we know? Carronade Island off the Kimberley coast has one of these little weapons, a Portuguese carronade. Now, it may have come off a Portuguese ship, may have come off a later ship, because probably other ships also used them, but there's also coins and things have been found. The Dutch, they were really big time in sort of skirting the oceans. The Dutch East India Company, one of the biggest corporate outfits in the early world, heavily engaged in the Spice Islands, Timor, the Indonesian archipelago. So they were doing all sorts of voyages around that area and starting to bump into this great south continent. Sometimes not quite by design, more by misadventure, because they were heading down to a certain southern latitude, then cross across to the east with the fine winds, and sometimes they'd bump into the ocean. So the Dutch were pretty active, and the first real serious touching on the coast that we know was up around Cape York, when Janssen came down there. He went into a bit of Torres Strait. You'll see his passage up here, and a bit down that side of the Gulf. Had some very nasty interactions with the local Aboriginal inhabitants, who put a few of his men to the spear, and he left rather disappointed. But numerous other Dutchmen sailed around different parts. One, of course, the infamous Dirk Hartog, somewhere down here he is, Hartog, put his plate on the island off near Shark Bay. And then others that sailed across here and actually named Arnhem Land after Arnhem in Old Holland. So they included people like Carstens and Pearson, and of course the most notable of all was Abel Tasman. So Tasman, well, before Tasman, William Jance came down the little old ship, the Dufkin, pretty small ships, these, going around these big oceans. This is a great replica built in Perth that sailed around. They had pretty primitive instruments to find their way, you know. They didn't have the full sextants and everything else and the great chronometers that helped to Cook and Flinders and other navigators apply. They had what was called an astrolabe, very early form of navigational instrument that sort of helped to find where you might be. And then Tasman. So he did numerous voyages, 1642 to 44. You see them there. One of his big voyages was a red line, sort of going right the outskirts of New Zealand, back of Tasmania, which of course he named Van Diemen's Land. That didn't get him a lot of the Australian continent. But his second voyage, he definitely sort of skirted the Kimberley coast and went back. So he was quite prolific and certainly left his mark. Now, there were shipwrecks along that Western Australian coast. So these ships, trading ships of the East India Company that was coming in to try and get to Batavia, which was then the capital of Indonesia, Dutch Indonesia, the Spice Island. So there are numerous stories of shipwrecks. There's stories of sailors having come ashore on the Western Australian coast and intermarrying, mingling with Aboriginal people, red-headed Aboriginal people. You know, all these wonderful stories have come about. But some of them, of course, the the Golden Dragon off Western Australia was one of the great finds because it was laden with treasure. And of course, the most notable one, with the most infamous story, was the poor Batavia, which crashed onto the Hootman Abrolhos, with all sorts of nasty things coming out of that. So, pretty much the Kimberley and Western Australian coasts were well defined by the Dutch navigators, and of course, one of them even made his way all the way round to South Australia, as far as out of Ceduna to the Nuits Archipelago, which later became the set piece for that great tale of Gulliver. That became the land of Lilliput when Gulliver's Travels was written. So they'd certainly been around and done quite a bit of mapping. Their presence was undoubtedly noted and recorded by different Aboriginal groups along the coast. One of the more interesting ones is on the Kimberley coast that a lot of cruise ships visit these days, on a place called Biggie Island. And this is the home of the famous Wandjina creation figures, great halo-headed spirit creators. But in this particular painting, they're a little bit interesting. You know, there's three gentlemen there sitting in what appears to be a very European type boat, and they seem to have pipes along with their halos. If I get this to work. So you've got the headdresses, which some people think are actually a takeoff on the Dutch mariners' caps, as well as the halos. They're not really the true halos of the Wandjinas. They go right round. Of course, Wandjinas don't have mouths, so they'd have nothing to stick the pipes in that they're smoking. So it's very strongly believed that this is a first representation of European adventurous sailors on the Kimberley coast with their clay pipes. And there's a good representation of that picture. Sadly now, due to excessive tourism in these very narrow catacombs, that picture's virtually disappeared, been rubbed off the walls. So it was something that was done probably only 300-400 years ago, so certainly wasn't set firmly in stone like other things. William Dampier, Englishman, pretty interesting character, privateer, buccaneer, explorer, adventurer, but he did some pretty interesting things, and he was the first Englishman to actually explore the Australian coastline. He ended up, of course, in the coast of WA, up in the Pilbara pretty much. He was also one of the first to make serious observation of flora and fauna, and also some note about the indigenous peoples that he encountered. And when he did his second voyage of two really big voyages, he was already a little bit knowledgeable of what he was getting into from what Tasman's records had been. So Dampier's voyages went round the world. He was a pretty good sort of sailor, and he hit the Kimberley coast up near King's Sound, up and around this region here, and he actually had to have his ship hauled up on the beach of the Kimberley in Beakaree and clean the hull, and he was the first one to do that, but it seemed to be common practice. So what he did do, he did write, produced some pretty interesting, and was the first recording of Australian sort of flora and fauna. Pretty interesting stuff altogether. In his little ship, the Signet, and his voyage around the world is a pretty interesting read because he did record some very interesting information about New Holland as he then knew it. On top of that, he also did have a reasonably good naturalist with, and this is a bit of a trivia fact, the first recording of the Sturt Desert pea came from his journey. So it occurred all the way up there in the Kimberley. And he also recorded, of course, the yellow bloodwood eucalypt. And he made collections in Shark Bay and on the Pilbara coast. And Sturt Desert pea, he described it. So it was before Captain Sturton had encountered it on his journeys into the interior here, the region north of Lake Eyre. So there are specimens still in Kew Gardens from Dampier's collection. So privateer, buccaneer, pretty interesting character, but certainly a taste for science. He did give a rather nasty tag to the local inhabitants. Not really completely indicative of what really was going on. I doubt that they were the most miserable people in the world. They're probably living a whole better lifestyle than most people in continental Europe and England. So Dampier had a pretty jaundiced view. But then we come to a really prolonged and important contact on our northern coast. And these came from the Indonesian islands where we'd nearly been connected. And on the monsoon winds, the traders and entrepreneurs from Sulawesi, Macassan, Roti sailed their big ocean-going prahs to Maragay, which was their name for the northern coast of Australia, Kimberley and Arnhem Land. And they started those voyages around the early 1700s. And that trade went till about 1906 when the British put a stop to it. And it was primarily coming in on the monsoonal winds that we have now to the north coast of Australia to harvest this. This is Bêche de Mer, sea cucumber, trepang. Occurs in the shallow water, slug-like a critter, and you would catch it and process it. Highly desirable in the Chinese market. They saw it as an aphrodisiac amongst other things. So this was very lucrative for the Macassans to come here. And they certainly hit the Kimberley coast, coming from places like Roti, like Macassan, Kupang, but they also went further. But on the Kimberley coast, there's still plenty of evidence of Macassan early settlements. Big hearths, big stone sort of rings where they had their big woks that they bored the trepang up in, and the odd tamarind tree. And this was pretty much the northern pathway. Went all the way along the Kimberley coast, along Arnhem Land, and right into, down to the bottom of where near today, so I've got a middle block there, in the bottom of the Arafura Gulf. Groot Island was a big stopover, just sitting right there. So all of that was pretty much territory for these early intrusions. Now, the local Aboriginal people didn't have a problem with this, because the one thing about these visitors is they went away. They weren't staying. They weren't disrupting the whole lifestyle of the existing Aboriginal population, especially the Olnu in Arnhem Land, which was very heavily populated. So they would set up their temporary camps, they would build their longhouses, thatched, they would have their boats there, they would have their big cooking hearths and drying smoke houses to process it. This is near Fort Wellington in Raffles Bay, now near Coburg Peninsula. And this was what was happening. Big woks, boiling up the trepang, and then they would be drying it in smoke houses, gutting it and taking it back. And they brought with them, of course, lots of interesting things. So Yolngu people and Kimberley people on that coast had a much more outgoing cosmopolitan view of the world because of this 300-year interaction, unlike the Aranda and the people in the desert or even down the south. So this contact was quite a pretty reasonable exchange. Of course, these visitors brought in all sorts of goods with them. They also brought a few plants. The most telltale sign of their presence, their camps, are the tamarind trees. They love tamarind, great spice. So tamarind trees grow up through north, usually on the Macassan side. And Matt Flinders, who was one of the next great navigators to actually hit this coast and chart it seriously for the British Admiralty, he actually met a Macassan fleet in 1802, over 100 vessels in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and he met up with them again off Nhulunbuy, off Arnhem Land, in what we call near the Wessel Islands and the English Company Islands. And there he met up with the commander of a fleet of over 1,000 ships, Probasso, here nicely sketched by his resident artist William Westall, as was Westall's sketch of the nation round the Malay roads where they met Probasso. And they had a pretty interesting meeting and interaction. And so there was a big fleet of ships coming here all through the coast from Macassan. And it brought a whole lot of things. Aboriginal people worked with the Macassans. They learnt dugout canoes from the Macassans instead of their more simplified log-type rafts, and also the use of sails. So Aboriginal people from 1700 on in that whole coastline of Arnhem Land were exceptional seafarers between their islands and everywhere else, using some of these methods that have been brought. And they're depicted in their art to this day. It's also depicted in the rock art. So there's lots of features there of the Macassan elements and visits. And all through Arnhem Land and the rock art, there's lots of evidence and lots of paintings of early contact periods, going from what we now know as the Moluccan fighting canoe through to a composite ship up there, Mount Borrowdale. It's part prow, part British steamship. So that artist sort of convoluted a few things, but these sort of would have been a common sight along the coast of northern Australia. And the connection was very strong. The Yolngu people went back to Macassan and intermarried with the Yolngu and vice versa. So only recently, one of the researchers in one of our universities discovered a wonderful hoard of photos from about the 1800s, or the 1800s, of Aboriginal people living in Macassan in Indonesia. Very clear link. Lots of ceremonies and festivals exchange. Even the famous Gama festival now has an interconnection with Indonesian. This is a whole Indonesian dance group coming in at one of the festivals in Darwin, working through that story. Now, the British, who'd well and truly taken over the continent, with James Cook planting the flag in the 1770s, were very keen to chart this whole continental coast. So the Admiralty was sending out numerous surveyors and captains to do that. One of the early ones, of course, was Matthew Flinders. So he had a very checkered career, and he virtually, amongst other things, had the task of circumnavigating the whole new continent and mapping it, and he did that exceptionally well. And he also gave the name Australia to what was then New Holland, New South Wales, Terra Incognita, the Great Southland. At the same time that he was cruising around, there was another gentleman from France, Nicolas Bourdin, sponsored by the Empress Josephine, wife of Napoleon. They had two different missions. Bourdin was a bit better equipped. He had 3 ships and fairly large frigates, much bigger than little old Investigator, an ex-collier that Flinders had to sort of navigate around the coastline. So this one from France was very well provided for, very well equipped, and it had a very interesting crew, a whole host of scientists, military officials. None of them got on very well, artists, who were set out on a scientific expedition to collect specimens for France and the Empress Josephine. So you can see here the different passages on the map. The green is the geography and the natural list, which are Bourdin's ships. And you can see where and what they went in their journey. So they covered quite a bit of ground. They didn't go right around the whole continent, certainly did a whole lot of work elsewhere. And of course, off Encounter Bay is where Flinders and Bourdin met for the first time on their various missions. They're a little bit sort of testy about the fact that their countries may well be at war, which often was the case, but they did have a pretty good dinner, I'm sure, on the French boat. The food may have been better, although Flinders did tell Bourdin there were lots of kangaroos on this island which is found to replenish their meat stocks. So, Bourdin left his mark, lots of places around being named on his journeys, Lassapede Islands, Bonaparte Archipelago, all up in the north, Cape Voltaire, Bonaparte Gulf. So he's naming pretty well. Didn't do so good in South Australia. If you happen to go to the Mortlock Library wing, second most beautiful library in the world, you'll see two maps, Bourdin's and Flinders. Bourdin's map's got all the French names, you know. Spencer Gulf was Gulf de Bonaparte. St Vincent Gulf was Gulf de Josephine. So all the French names all over our South Australian map. It had to be for Captain Cook and that planting the flag, we might be speaking French. Flinders map usurped all of those names, and we have a few remnants left. So, you know, we have Cape de Coudie, we have, you know, odd bits and pieces of the French naming, but he did a lot better in the north of Australia. He did bring back a lot of information, really interesting stuff about the weird animals and plants on this continent, and his scientists and naturalists and artists, even though they didn't all get on very well, did produce some pretty interesting depictions, including the local inhabitants. And of course, they also brought back specimens. So in the Garden of Versailles, you could have kangaroos and emus once they got back. Would have delighted the Empress, I'm sure. Matt Flinders, well, he's a lot more focused. He had a very definite mission, and it wasn't just science. It was really to establish the British sovereignty over this new continent. He had a pretty illustrious career from Lincolnshire. He'd actually served with the infamous Captain Bligh. Bligh might have been a bit of a hard taskmaster on the Bounty that got him into trouble, but he was a superlative seaman, one of the great navigators of the world also, along with Cook and Flinders, who proved his point when Fletcher Christian and the mutineers tossed him overboard in a whaleboat. He managed to sail it back across the Pacific all the way to Timor, one of the great small boat journeys of the world. So Flinders served in the various battles, but his really big thing was he, with his friend George Bass, of course, did that little voyage in a small whaleboat to prove Bass Strait was actually a strait and separate Tasmania. But it was really his voyages in 1802, 1803. And like I said, he'd served with Bligh, so he'd certainly learned a bit of the art from him. He also had with him pretty good naturalists. Naturalists really predominated, going right back to Joseph Banks with Captain Cook. So Brown on board Flinders ship did some pretty interesting recordings, along with Ferdinand Bower. And they both brought back animals, birds and mineral specimens. Not quite as much as the French expedition, but 2,000 odd species, not too bad. And of course we have Mount Brown named after him in the Flinders Ranges. Some of the sort of sketches and things come back. I see the Eastern Bilbies featuring, which is all pretty good. And then we have Philip Parker King. So these were all gentlemen of the British Navy, and it was the British Navy that was really executing the surveys of this new land. So he did numerous surveys in the north of the Australian coast, and you can see that he pretty much went over Flinders tracks, but even more precisely to really map particularly the Kimberley coast down that side. And he did it in a very small ship, much smaller than Flinders, the Mermaid. It's only a cutter, not big at all, where there's not very many people on board. Now he's operating in waters up in the Kimberley with 9-metre tides, a variety of winds, sometimes no wind, and having to chart these places. He had a very interesting companion, Bungaree, who had actually served originally with Flinders. He was a man from Sydney, took to all the European ways, learnt the language, even went to England, and he was a pretty handy person to have on board ship, particularly when you're trying to pacify the original inhabitants as you're meeting them along your way along that very convoluted coast. So Bungaree certainly made his bit. So Cambridge Gulf up in the Kimberley coast really attracted King. He thought that this was great country. Probably his overblown description led to a very ill-fated attempt at settlement. We'll get there. And of course, like Dampier, he had to careen his ship. It was leaking, it wasn't going well, had to haul it up on a beach at a place in the Kimberley coast with 9-metre tides. That worked pretty well. So he ended up at Careening Bay. And there he pulled the ship out on one of the more famous historical locations in Australia, along with probably Burke's Dig Tree, where the carpenter engraved in this huge boab the mermaid and the ear and everything else. It's heavily visited now by Kimberley coastal cruise ships. Just about everyone goes there. And the parks and the rangers from the local Indigenous rangers have put up some pretty good boardwalks and things to protect the ear and the tree. He also recorded quite a bit about the local life in the place, so his early drawings of huts and that. So, you know, generally people were having reasonably substantial sort of lifestyle and putting up things that were more than just the odd shelter. They were using rafts and things to boat around, which Parker King observed and which still occurred up until relatively recent times, but certainly the dugout canoe introduced by the Macassans far outdid these much more flimsy watercraft. He also had a botanist with him, Alan Cunningham, another man who made his name with all the different plants and species, quite a few named after him, the Wahenia particularly. And Cunningham also was the first one to describe, and I can't go back, I don't think, no, to describe the rainforest, the dense rainforest down on the end of the Hunter River, which predominates the monsoonal vine forest in Kimberley. They also recorded lots of influence weaponry, and this is the real stuff, very much like record the very famous Kimberley points, a very unique way of making a spear point that is pretty much endemic to Kimberley people. He also then found an amazing river when he got down into the Sound, and this river took him a long way in. Of course, it was the Prince Regent River, which is the name he gave it, but more importantly, some spectacular landforms at the mouth of that river around Mount Trafalgar and Mount Waterloo, all named at the time to commemorate the great victory over Napoleon that the Duke of Wellington had. And more importantly, he certainly gave the Hanoverian mob in England a good take by naming these very impressive peaks. But the really important thing for him was fresh water. And going up to Prince Regent, he hit on this waterfall, the King's Cascade, and climbed to the top. And of course, it's spouting fresh water, still does it these days. Most cruise ships go in there, have a shower. Also has some very resident large crocodiles, one of which did some very sad demise of a young lady back after the America's Cup who happened to go with her companions for a swim and ended up being stalked by a rather large crocodile that she couldn't outswim. So, not the easiest place to handle. John Lord Stokes comes pretty much after Parker King, again on surveys, served on the HMS Beagle, famous ship that went all around the world, mapping and recording under Captain Fitzroy, but Stokes took over command of the Beagle on the last part of his voyages. He'd actually served with Charles Darwin, and again, Stokes went all around that northern coast, mapping, recording, and also information about the lie of the land, people, certainly very substantial huts and things, even in northern Australia, not just in the south, and some really interesting critters. You know, they call them alligators, but the good old snappers, saltwater crocs, and they had some rather interesting events, like Stokes got caught out in a small boat exploring on shore. The longboat had gone down a bit. The 9-metre tidal fall suddenly brought a rush of water in, and they were well away from the boat with plenty of crocodiles around, and they only just made it back before the tide would have engulfed them to get back to their longboat. So it was a bit of a lesson about the dangers of the northern coastline. Stokes did pretty well for him, got a few things named after him, did very sterling service for British Admiralty all around the Empire, and in the end, of course, he was promoted to Admiral. He did better than King, so he had a pretty illustrious life. And his charts, like all of them, were extremely precise and still used. I mean, some of Flinders' charts, King's charts, really amazingly accurate, given that they were only using lead lines and boats and rowing. On the land, George Grey went into the wilds of the Kimberley, and it was pretty wild and woolly country on the Glenelg River. And that was his first big expedition in the interior of Australia. And he explored the Glenelg River. There's a bit of his track. Now, apart from writing a pretty good journal, his real claim to fame, other than becoming governor of South Australia eventually, was that he was always told to familiarise with the natives, treat them as equals, blah, blah, blah. That was all good palaver from England. Did never happen on the frontier. And, you know, he was reminded that the Aborigines is the right of the soil. Well, a settler going out didn't see that. Published a very good journal. Most importantly was his discovery of the great Wandjina art figures, which he sort of drew and sketched as the first one, and he thought that these were pretty amazing. Took a lot of poetic license, and I described them. The Wandjinas there at Glenelg River look nothing like this. He sort of got a bit enamoured with it all, describing them as females, even describing some of them having words in the halos which were not there. They were more just effects, and even his appearances of the dress certainly wasn't good. The face that he saw in the stone on the right was just a piece of rock work, you know, it wasn't anything anybody put there. So, with all of this exploration, the Brits then decided they had to put boots on the ground. So we have the litany of the most ill-fated settlement attempts ever in Australia across the north. They sort of range from first attempt on Tiwi Islands to going around to Raffles Bay, Port Victoria, Scape Cliffs, all the way across to Cape York to a place called Somerset, just below Cape York. The Tiwi Islands, two of them, Bathurst, Melville, fairly ferocious group of First Nations individuals. And you can see they're rather, even today, looking rather nasty. They make the most nasty spears, you know, not only do the barbs go backwards, they go forwards as well. So once you've got it stuck in you, there's no way you can get it out. Well, the Dutch decided to come and visit them. They landed there at Tiwi Island, and they were met by these guys, and they ran away really quickly. And the Tiwi thought that was pretty good, so some years ago, they set up a commemoration of this event, and it was a big deal. They were there in full array, dressed up. The Dutch ambassador was there. A rowboat of Dutch-looking sailors came ashore to be quickly chased off, and everybody had a hoot and thought it was wonderful. They still celebrate it, and the Dutch were quite happy to go along with it. Nobody ever occupied the Tiwi Islands. The Brits tried it, didn't learn the lesson of the Dutch. So 1827 to 29, they set up Fort Dundas on Melville Island. First thing they had to do is absolutely raise all the surrounding vegetation. They had to clear every bit of it so people couldn't sneak up to their habitation. They had to build a wooden palisade all around it, and they virtually were incarcerated in that for their 2 years they were there. They never got out any further. The surgeon made the big mistake of going for a day walk without his dog outside the palisade and got several spears stuck in him. That was the end of him. So the Brits did it. They abandoned that. Nobody ever went to Tiwi Islands again, except by invite many years later. So, round the corner from Tiwi, on Coburg Peninsula, now a famous national park, they set up another attempt at a place called Raffles Bay. Now, it was a little bit out of the main channel where people were travelling, Bowen Strait, and that's where the Macassan traders were going. The intent was put down the English presence, engage with the Macassan traders and keep the French and the Dutch out. The first commander at this Fort Wellington at Raffles Bay, another little wooden palisade and that, Captain Sterling, yeah, he set it up, hand over to his second in command, Captain Smythe. He got a terrible approach to the local Wancha Aboriginal people. The whole place was in disarray. Smythe hated every bit of his command, wrote copious letters about how bad it was, and he was then replaced by a younger gentleman, Captain Collett Barker. Now the name rings a bell because we have Mount Barker, and Collett Barker, of course, unfortunately lost his life swimming the Murray Mouth and getting speared by the Narrandee for some good reason, nothing to do with Barker himself. But Barker turned everything around. He engaged with the Wancha people, he put the settlement onto a decent track, he started to connect with the Macassan trading fleet. But Smythe letters had gone back to England, and it was a very tortuous path. I often go to Sydney, then get to the Colonial Office, and then a year later a letter come back. So when Barker had got everything humming and running and was actually working, he got a letter to say abandon the settlement, shut it down. Captain Smythe, and Barker, being a good company man, decided he'd do exactly that, and he did. And he should have just held the course center and said, no, I've got all working in that, have another think about it. Didn't happen. So that settlement got closed down. Barker left, went down to King Sound off Albany, did a great job there, then came to South Australia and was given the task to sort of look down the Murray Mouth. He was governor material without a doubt. The reason he got speared, the Narrandjee were having bad interaction with the sealers and whalers on Kangaroo Island, and also with interference with their women. So when they saw this white fellow suddenly appear in front of them, they thought, well, he's one of them. Sad story for Barker. The more inglorious settlement was Victoria's settlement at Port Essington. So this settlement lasted a little bit longer, but the trouble is, where they did it in Port Essington is so far down in the bay that it was completely out of the mainstream trade route of any passing traffic. Nobody would bother to go down there. So they sat in this godforsaken place with no real purpose and no real connection. And they had everything there. They built wonderful stone houses with chimneys. They wore their woolen uniforms. They suffered intolerably in the tropical heat and malaise. They had a cyclone hit them early on that blew Government House, which was there on stilts, a prefab, off its moorings, wrecked their boat that was there. So for the time they were there, it was a pretty tough existence. One highlight was Ludwig Leichhardt turned up on his grand expedition out of Brisbane and made it through Kakadu and Arnhem Land and suddenly appeared there on the doorstep of this settlement in the Port Essington. So that one also went by the wayside. Camden Harbour, well, this is in where Parker King had waxed so lyrically. A company formed. They took 50,000 sheep up there, settlers. Drought, the dry conditions of 9 months of no rain knocked them into smithereens. The sheep all died, so did settlers, and it was a disaster. And the Camden Harbour Pastoral Association very quickly went bankrupt. So Gray, Stokes and King had basically given the wrong information for what was happening there. It's a visiting site these days, but really it is just a very sad and tragic story. Way on the other side of the continent, Cape York, also settlements established up near the very tip of Cape York. There's Somerset, and then over here is Thursday Island. So this is where the settlement occurred. Again, about 10 years or so. It had the infamous Jardine brothers in charge. John Jardine set it up as magistrate, commandant of everything. Frank Jardine ruled the roost with Martini Henry rifles and iron fist and a fair bit of brutality. They had to deal with headhunters coming down from the New Guinea Islands in their canoes looking for the odd trophies. Very antagonistic local Aboriginal groups, and they took a heavy toll on that. Jardine had a charmed life, somehow he managed to avoid all the spears and everything that was thrown at him. The Aboriginal population in that area reduced from about 3,000 to 300, partly through disease and largely through the efforts of the Jardines, who have a river and that named after them, but they were pretty tough. Kimberley Coast, still interesting, now to settler, explorer, squatters. Most notorious one, probably, Joseph Bradshaw. Gave his name to that interesting Bradshaw art, which he sketched right there, these very elegant figures. Looks nothing like the real site, mind you, like Gray. He took a lot of poetic or artistic licence. But he decided he would set up a pastoral lease near the Prince Regent River, and he did that in cahoots with Aeneas Gunn. So they set up in what's called the St George Basin below Mount Trafalgar and set up Murrugai. Aeneas Gunn wasn't very complimentary of the local inhabitants either. He sort of was a bit like Dampier, he didn't think they were worth a heck of a lot in any way and word. So his contribution wasn't particularly good, but that also did not last, although Gunn did wax lyrical about the country and how powerful it was. So, Brockman, the Surveyor General from the Western Australian Government, went up on land base to try and map out locations. I don't know, I tried to make that Father Therese go straight 10 times, and every time I've done it, it comes back with this, I don't know. There's poor old squat Father Fulgentius Therese, a very visionary missionary, Benedictine from Spain, who explored the Kimberley coast back in the turn of the century, not long after Brockman, in a schooner with local Aboriginal people, settled on the Drysdale River to establish a mission. And it would have been a scary sight. This is a reenactment down here, where the black robe Benedictine monks are coming across the mud flat to the big boab, which is called the Landing Tree. You could imagine the thoughts of the local Quinny Aboriginal inhabitants when they saw these figures come across, a bit out of Star Wars, you know, like these black robe beings. But they did establish a mission, which is still there today at what's called Columbaroo. Furlers came in big time very soon after the turn of the century, along with the land-based squatters. So they did their coastal bit, particularly the Japanese. And of course, one of the biggest pearling ventures on that whole coast now run by the Pasquale family. They're depicted in the rock art, so they were certainly seen. They engaged with Aboriginal people along the Arnhem Land coast, along the Kimberley, not quite as benignly as the Macassans. There was quite a lot of altercation, but they certainly left their mark. So the whole coastline had an imprimatur, but it had that very long, deep history. And then you had all these different nationalities. It's virtually a sort of mirror of the multicultural potpourri that we've become with our migration that's followed from those very early migrations. And there's a bit of a piece from a couple of very good friends of mine that did a lot of work on the Kimberley, wrote a great book that epitomises not just the Kimberley, but also the whole northern coast of Australia. That a lot of things on that coastline history have come from the sea, whether they be fishermen, traders, pastoralists, missionaries, and of course also the original long-term inhabitants. So that's a very quick run through impact settlement on the northern coast of Australia. I'll take questions.
Thank you very much, Jock. That was a fabulous exposition. Thousands of years,